Thanks, folks. It's a true honour to be included in this distinguished symposium, in this distinguished room. Thank you very much for having me. So the notes which follow build anecdotally upon some of the insights I heard yesterday as well from Timothy Hyde and Lucia Relace and Andrew Leach and Eva Louise Pelconen and actually just from Anna. So my notes today concern what we might call the pragmatic turn we're witnessing. For example, the surge of interest in the humanities and social sciences at large, in pragmatist philosophy, in the creeping influence of science and technology studies and ethnography, or in architecture, the steady ascent of a post-criticality, which is probably to say a sort of pragmatism, or in politics, the bid by Obama-era liberalism to renegotiate sectarian politics, or in environmentalism, the reconsideration of nuclear and genetic engineering, or in management, the advocacy of design thinking. These are all responses to a world that seems ever more complex and immune to grand gestures, yet which seems to demand ever more intervention. The matrix of crisscrossing relations and flows is a motif of our era, as we see in the poster for this symposium. And so I find myself wondering, as an historian, as a teacher, and not the least as a political subject myself, how I feel about this pragmatic turn. It smacks of positivism and concession. It suggests the loss of an ideal and a scorn for abstraction. I'm at once uneasy with this and intrigued by it. So I'll suggest that the pragmatic turn sets up something of a dialectic or conversation or blurring, if you prefer, between the ideal and the pragmatic in architecture. To some extent, this blurriness also transcends the old opposition between an operative history and an autonomous, disinterested history, but I still love to fury. I'll offer as a rather prosaic example my experience leading an art history graduate seminar at UC Davis last fall, which worked with the education department of the Crocker Art Museum in Sacramento to develop visitor and docent notes about the museum's major new extension, designed by Gwathmey Siegel and Associates. The seminar began by studying the building using conventional art historical questions, asking, for instance, about the history of Gwathmey Siegel and the style the practice employs. We began, in other words, as though we were studying a quasi-autonomous work of art, using the quasi-autonomous disciplinary methods of art history. We could have left it there, dutifully noting the long reach of the international style and the legacy of the New York Five, but we instead started imagining the building within deeper frameworks. An ethnographer joined the seminar, and we drew upon ethnography and actor network theory to understand the Crocker as a site for its constituent interests. We discussed with the director of the Crocker Museum her uses of the architectural model as it sat there on her desk. The role of benefactors, their names inscribed upon glass blocks, mounted in the lobby. We discussed the nature of collaboration, even where it results in less than perfect decisions. Thanks to that part of our method derived as best we could from science and technology studies, the seminar was better able to understand how the building is really made, the importance to its program of a large service elevator, for example, the effects of constraints in budget, the adaptation to preservation requirements, to site modifications, to the rethinking of the program. All these things frankly mitigate against that sense of the autonomous ideal invoked when described as an iconic work of architecture with a big fat capital A, as Gwathmey Siegel and Associates chose to do in an announcement they placed in Sacramento's local newspaper, which you see here. And we discovered something very surprising. Charles Gwathmey was chosen by the Crocker Board in 2000 for his willingness to collaborate, to compromise, and subsequent press releases about the design of the new Crocker consistently emphasized the new building's concern with context. This is the same Charles Gwathmey, you will recall, whose star rose among New York's so-called white architects, who made the case from 1969 on for the continued development of an Olympian modernist mode so abstract as to provoke more pragmatically oriented postmodern architects into describing themselves as grey. And yet, from 2000 to 2010, the Crockers' relationship to Gwathmey and his team only deepened based upon collaboration and compromise. It's not clear to me whether, as an architectural historian, I can interpret this pragmatism, though I can nonetheless envisage a future for myself alongside the ethnographer as we close in on a building like Gwathmey's from two methodological directions. How else to appreciate a compositional method that permits an architect to design fluidly around and through programmatic demands and limitations? The formal simultaneity Gwathmey derived from synthetic cubism, in other words, crystallized a programmatic simultaneity. Gwathmey's delight in juxtaposition and superimposition seems actually to have thrived on the very pain of meeting the client's unremitting demands. Gwathmey's phenomenal transparency, I believe, became a strategy less of aesthetic autonomy, more of flexible planning. For all that architectural history needs to be exposed to such febrile realities of behavior, materials, institutions, and money, what architectural history guarantees is an attentiveness to the aesthetic. Take, for instance, the Crockers' Northern Rotunda, a front door, of course, and a place for the cashier, but also a mnemonic device through its cylindrical form, recalling classical ceremony and a high calling, without which design could be a chaotic search for whatever works. Or observe the way in which the curve of the Crockers' exedra blends into the sill of its pocket window. This observation is at once an art historical connoisseurship and an ethnographic detection of agency. Without reference to the pursuit of beauty, I think, a study of this design would make no sense. Indeed, without a belief in the civilizing and beautifying objectives of the Crocker, objectives with which Gwathmey Siegel imply in their advertisement, it would be impossible to differentiate actions upon which it was and was not deemed possible to compromise. Without something to believe in, the museum's director put it in our interview, it would not be possible to do her job, to see it through. As an historian, I detect hints of an operative principle at work in the making of this building. An operative entangled, a tacit arrangement between the designer, the trustees, the curators, the benefactors. It's a weak operative principle, one might think. One semantically muddled as rotundas and floating planes mediate competing demands for gallery space, commerce, and conference rooms, but one that is perceptible precisely through the push-pull of the building's making. One task for the historian can be to identify that operating principle, that understanding as to what ultimately is at stake, an understanding practically lost, I wonder, to the networked agents themselves. The historian might track it, announce it, and convene around it a conversation about the matters of concern, as Bruno Latour might say, that make it manifest. The historian, like the architect, like the client, like the benefactor, like the visitor, lodges a stake in the assembly, accepts a place within it. Like the architect and the museum director, the historian tacitly accepts the corruption and engine of political economy as a given to be survived, worked, hijacked, negotiated, and overcome. Enmeshed in this way, the possibility for an autonomous architectural history seems as remote as it's ever been. But it does mean we can look unembarrassed at what architecture and architectural history may actually be, practices formed dialectically between senses of the ideal and the pragmatic. Nothing is as pragmatic, for instance, as the aspiration for autonomy. The demand for autonomy has to be nimble institutionally and practically to survive in the real world, ferreting out resources and protectors in universities, museums, and publishing. White architecture is a little grey after all. Indeed, the operative and the autonomous are, after all, two sides of the same coin, since both imply that architecture can transcend its context, either by stepping out of it or orchestrating it, whereas architecture, we surely know, is the most entangled of all the arts with social, economic, material production. Adhere too closely either to a sense of the operative or to a sense of autonomy, and I wonder if we risk misunderstanding how art and design actually act in the world. An historian who studies the political economy of Byzantium recently told me that he puzzles why his art historian colleagues feel the need to justify, as he put it, the objects of their study. As an historian of political economy, it strikes him, for instance, that later Byzantine art wasn't purposefully awkward, as art historians suggest, but was the result of de-skilling because of the terrible urban attrition following the age of Justinian. The urge to justify, which underwrites operative history, of course, is a bad habit of art history which probably stems from the discipline's origins in Hegel, him again, Wolflin and Burckhardt. But the sang-froid sensibility of my colleagues' no-nonsense history has its costs too, because it short-sells the significance of the Byzantine artists overreaching past the shortcomings in their skills and materials towards their ideal of the divine realm beyond the picture plane. You know, I'm comfortable that art and architectural history defends intention and the redemptive possibility of aesthetics and design in a way that seems odd to historians in other fields, like my colleague in Byzantine political economy. Architecture can be more than the relentless piling up of material culture, and architectural history can help us distinguish between capitulation to the world as it is and was, and the search for the world as it could yet be. It can encourage scrutiny about the sort of bargains that get struck, about how those bargains get transcribed into a material and aesthetic mnemonic aid for the future. It can speak of the conspiracy to do better than is strictly required. No building is ever enough. Buildings are only ever holding operations, I now think, strivings, position stakers. And the Crocker, I think, was trying to establish a civic culture in a privatizing realm. And Gwathmey wanted to announce that formally. Though I remain somewhat indifferent personally to Gwathmey's architecture, I liked how our study of the building accepted the struggle of being tangled by several inputs and demands at once. And then I think a certain symmetry and solidarity between architectural design and architectural history, between my work as an historian and the work of architecture that I study, that too becomes apparent. If I teach that architecture cannot conceivably be entirely autonomous, then it's hard to imagine architectural history as autonomous either. Historical practice, too, is somewhat pragmatic. It was clear, for instance, that my seminar about the Crocker was being produced by the building it studied, driven in its outreach by scrutiny right now of the University of California's public worth. Putting aside any compulsion to justify works of art on the one hand and to appear aloof on the other, I start to accept in architectural history what I begrudgingly accept in my architect colleagues and in my preferred historical subjects: a desire to do good, to remain open to the possibility of improvement, to take advantage of the momentary entanglement of a middle-class intelligentsia with production. Pragmatism and design seem to drive one another as an embattled reformism pursues its ideals by forging messy compromises. Thank you very much.